it's made up of a series of short essays. And much like the relationship between shots and a motion picture, each short piece was unique, but implicitly linked to every other one, often through an effect of juxtaposition. So the question is, why did I choose this method? And the answer is this approach was initially suggested to me by the film itself. 1927's silent film vehicle for horror star Lon Chaney, who's shown here. Mr. Wu tells the story of a proud Mandarin warlord whose daughter becomes involved with a caddish Englishman. In the end, Wu must kill his daughter to save her soul, don't ask, and he attempts to exact revenge on his daughter's lover's family. It's a film that could be described as incoherent at best, with veering sympathies and a style that ranges from boring to very extraordinarily innovative. Then there was the whole question of context. I saw the film at the Cinematheque Française, which is a huge film archive that comes from the original collection of a film scholar and preservationist called Henri Lannoy. It is sort of the mecca for all cinephiles. So I couldn't write about the film without taking into account my personal experience of going there, which was so much of what made this film a film object for me. So I couldn't just write another thesis and neglect the lived experience. So I drew on three main inspirations for learning how to structure this. First, there was the work of the 18th century historian Louis-Sébastien Mercier, who described Paris in snapshots that mimicked the disorder of the city. Roland Barthes also used a similar technique in his own autobiography. He used fragments to kind of translate the nature of himself and the multiplicity of himself. And finally, I also took a page from the musical prose of Sebald's The Rings of Saturn, which is blending novel, almost music, and essay. I also wanted to go into the series of encounters with and around the film Mr. Wu, with the knowledge that a written essay is never a film, that somehow in describing a film text you need to take into account that you are not giving the image itself, that the image has a concrete component and an ambiguity of texture that written work cannot ever equal just by the difference of the two media. And finally, I wanted to break with normal academic structures, which ignore how much form needs to be a function of content. Intro, body, conclusion, it's sort of like the continuity system of writing. It's one option, it's not the only stylistic option whereby you can make a point. And also I think that there's something almost desperate in the desire to wrap everything up in a conclusion, which this film is clearly resisting. For instance, where do you even start with an image like this? It's so strange. Here we see Lon Chaney directing what appears to be a troupe of female musicians, and there's a lot of places you could go with this publicity image. It's from 1927, and first of all, you could look at the geographic location. This is the Lion Building at MGM Studios, and you can tell that by the building in the background and also the laurel leaf right there. So this was a studio image. It was produced by the studio for distribution. You can also tell that it was a somewhat important event since the director, William Nye, who no one but me would probably recognize in this Zoom, but here he is. And this is also one of the film's stars, and I suspect the wife of then MGM producer Irving Thalberg here. So this was a pretty big event. And yet, what can we really make of the fact that they had this horror star as this Mandarin warlord directing a group of female musicians? Are they trying to say, don't be afraid of this film, even though it's kind of creepy and spooky and filled with all this violence? He's just good, clean fun. But this is, again, where I think that you need to step back and just appreciate the strangeness of this image and not try to impose an interpretation on it, which is what I was trying to do in my thesis. Another image that has this quality for me, this window is an impossible window. It exists in the film in a death scene, but we see in the entire space of the room, and this window isn't part of it. This window is spatially impossible. So in that way, it is also symbolic formally of the beyond. It is something that is outside of the diegesis. It's the setting sun of death. So usually in movies, when we see these kind of genius touches like this, we ask, where does it come from? And usually in movies, we assume that this is from the guiding intelligence, the director, the auteur. And so I investigated Mr. Wu's director, William Nye, and many of his films portray an interest in script and in writing. This is a still from Mr. Wu, where the Chinese text just bleeds right into an English translation. And this is from Allotment Wise, when two female criminals write in lipstick on a stool because they can't talk, they're being bugged by police. And we also see in his work there's a lot of windows, there's a lot of frames within frames, which seems to suggest a coherent style. However, probably the most salient feature of this man's career was Orientalism. He directed Mr. Wu. He directed the Poverty Row monogram Mr. Wong cycle, which is, this is from, you can see the Chinese scroll and the hanged Chinese man here. And in one of these films, he even thought so much of this Orientalist strain of his style that he even put his own name in front of the Buddha. But here again, you have to ask, wait, this is a D-list director. Are these patterns, these motifs of auteurship really there, or is this just the lens of my perspective, colored by a certain theory? And it begs the question, how far can you stretch a thesis of auteurism before the thesis proves itself whether it's right or wrong? And I'll just let you dwell with that question as I move on to my clip here. Exit the show. Now this clip takes place at a part in the film when Mr. Wu has to kill his daughter in order to save her soul. So here it is. And I've preserved the actual total silence of the clip since that's how I saw it at the Cinematheque. So for me, this clip synthesizes three uncanny places in Western culture. First of all, there's the Orient that we see in this pervasive style, in the mise-en-scène, in the pattern, this swirling pattern on the curtain. And it's interesting because a lot of critics at the time thought that Mr. Wu was a mystery, and they listed it as such in their reviews, when really there's nothing mysterious about it. It follows a relatively straightforward, if somewhat convoluted plot. I think that the reason why they referred to this film as a mystery is because of the air of mystery that imbues exoticism as a whole and draws people to the cinema. This is part of the exoticism, the trappings that make movies so visually appealing. And the second uncanny element is the cinema itself. We see only one other curtain in this film, one other curtain of this scope, and that is in the first shot of the film. It's under the credit sequence. It's it's almost as though the credit sequence are ushering you into the cinema. Isn't the cinema, too, a sort of foreign country where the otherness of things appears to us through their projected images? In fact, this first shot of Mr. Wu is beckoning us into this uncanny realm of illusions. And I think it was really formally clever to have this plot point, this central plot point, to reflect this first image of the film. And the third uncanny element is, of course, death. Watching this clip at the Cinematheque, I couldn't help but think it was the most masterfully elliptical description of, or depiction of a murder that I'd ever seen. If any of you have ever been in a film class, first-year film students always want to show murder. It is like the first thing that they want to show. There's something about death, about the parting of the soul from the body in traditional concepts that makes it so tantalizing to want to show it, to want to capture it. But this curtain seems to be playing with the audience, to ask them if they really want to see what's on the other side, to ask them if they really want to see the spectacle of death. And finally, by not showing what can't really be shown, the mystery of death, the curtain paradoxically makes the horror of the situation present to us through the absence. And isn't that what cinema is after all? It's a presence of an absence. The curtain, the characters, everything in this is actually dead, but yet it appears to us through the magic of cinema. And I think that Mr. Wu, despite its flaws as a film, is capable of bringing this to the surface more than any other film I've seen. So, thank you very much. And do you have any questions for me? Yes?
They consider it a mystery?
They, in a lot of reviews at the time, they said, come and see Mr. Wu, this mystery, or they said, the sinister Mr. Wu is a mysterious story about, like they really were emphasizing this mystery element or categorizing it in a genre different than what it is, because it's in fact an Oriental melodrama. It's sort of a variation on Madame Butterfly in a way. And yes?
I was wondering, was this considered, you know it's considered a mystery and there was misconceptions. What was the critical reception of the film?
Well, it's interesting because, we see this and we kind of cringe at all this really evident Orientalism and how stereotyped and the actors in yellowface. And even at the time, it was criticized for that. In fact, one writer talked about the daughter being about as Chinese as a French high heel. So it was critically received with a lot of approval for the stunning look of it, but actually the director took a lot of flack. They said it was kind of unimaginative, which I can't see how anybody who saw that scene could describe it that way. It was pretty much a mixed bag. They seemed to say, come see the movie, it's really pretty to look at, it'll pull at your heartstrings, but at the end it's pretty silly. Which is a pretty good evaluation of the movie overall, I think. One thing I didn't get to with this, my project also included a lot of talk about paratextual materials and how they bled into the movie, but also about the Cinematheque itself, because it is in and of itself a really fascinating text, and the way in which cinephile culture has really changed. Because a movie like this is not the kind of movie that tends to get studied. I feel that a film like this that's done by a lesser director doesn't really have the kind of high caliber academic potential that a lot of films get analyzed for, even though it does include a lot of formal inversions. Like this shot to me, does anybody know The Passenger by Antonioni? Well, there's a final shot, this death shot, that's really very similar to this. And that shot has been analyzed to death, no pun intended, but this one really hasn't. And I think that there is this tendency by the academicization, that's a word, of film culture has made it so that films like this tend to get marginalized, and they also tend to get closed down, which was the exact opposite of what I wanted to do with this film. And because this film only exists in the vaults, there are certain parts of it that can't be approached anymore. For instance, there's a final shot of Mr. Wu and his daughter ascending to heaven that you won't find on the current DVD of it. I sort of thought I'd hallucinated this until I read an allusion to it in a review. So that shot is inaccessible. It's in a way that movies really aren't nowadays. We think of movies as hugely accessible. So I am the spokesperson for this film. I am the film. If you want to talk to the film, you need to talk to me. So on that note, I think I'll end. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.